In this pod slice summary of the Huberman Lab Podcast, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett and Dr. Andrew Huberman discuss the complex nature of emotions, their neurological and psychological bases, and the role of facial expressions in communicating them. Challenging conventional wisdom, Dr. Barrett posits that no single set of physical markers can definitively correspond with a particular emotion, a view that contrasts with the traditional scientific understanding that specific emotional states can be diagnosed through certain patterns of physiological changes, brain activity, and facial expressions. One key aspect they discuss is the long-standing belief that altering facial expressions can cause shifts in emotions. Despite many holding this view, Dr. Barrett suggests this is a misinterpretation. Instead, she articulates that brain and muscles are engaged in a constant conversation, sending signals to each other, and changes in facial expression are just part of this larger chain of communication. According to Dr. Barrett, humans don't simply read emotions from facial expressions. Rather, they make inferences about the emotional meaning of facial movements in a context comprising an ensemble of sensory signals, visual, auditory, olfactory, as well as those emerging from within their own bodies. She emphasizes that these interpretations are made based on the brain's ability to predict what's going to happen next, learned through repetitive patterns over time. Among the fascinating insights that emerge from this discussion, one of the most striking is the fact that the brain and body are inextricably connected in the emotional process, and that what we often view as simple linear cause-effect relationships between expressions and emotions are much more complex and interlinked. Lastly, the conversation nullifies the notion that emotional states are static and easily diagnosable based on certain physical or facial markers. Reiterating these subtle complexities, Dr. Barrett mentions the inability of scientists over the last 150 years to agree on what constitutes an emotion. According to her, even the core components or building blocks of emotions are much disputed, mainly because none of these building blocks are specific to emotion alone. This discussion presents a deeper understanding of the mechanisms underlying emotions, emphasizing the dynamic and interconnected nature of our emotional states and the grains of unpredictability that make them hard to interpret and regulate. In this compelling part of the conversation, Dr. Barrett delves deeper into her unconventional understanding of facial expressions, emotions, and the intersection of the two. She challenges the dominant narrative, going beyond the popular perception that certain facial expressions invariably denote specific emotional states. Clarifying her position, Dr. Barrett illuminates the paradox of predictability within emotional expression. She posits that individuals display a diverse range of facial expressions corresponding to a single emotional state. For instance, one might scowl in anger approximately 35% of the time, but there are countless other ways that anger might manifest facially. This directly contradicts traditional beliefs that there is a one-to-one correspondence between a given facial expression and a specific emotional state. Dr. Barrett emphasizes how context and personal experiences significantly influence the interpretation of facial expressions. In her research, she found that facial expressions are not universal, but are instead highly variable and shaped by the individual's sociocultural milieu. Interestingly, Dr. Barrett and her colleagues read over 1,000 papers over 2 years, leading them to the conclusion that there is no steadfast rule for correlating facial expressions of emotions and their universality. Instead, they found that the manner in which people maneuver their faces during instances of emotional expression is incredibly diverse. Referencing Darwin's conventional theories, Dr. Barrett shares her belief that treating past textual concepts as definitively accurate might not be productive, specifically since a universal understanding of facial expressions of emotion hasn't been convincingly established in the scientific context. Challenging the traditional understanding of emotions as fixed entities, Dr. Barrett introspects them from a more process-oriented perspective, considering each emotion as a collection of dynamic occurrences instead of a static state. Additionally, she highlights the vast variability within each emotional category, once again hinting at the incredible diversity and complexity of human emotional states and their physical expressions. These states are often shaped by individual contexts, experiences, and goals, reminding us of the deeply personal and individual nature of emotional experiences. Dr. Barrett also touches upon the cultural variability in interpreting facial expressions, further decoupling the notion of universal readability of emotions from facial expressions. In summary, Dr. Barrett proposes a radically different understanding of facial expressions and emotions, emphasizing variability, subjectivity, and the profound influence of context and culture. In this detailed discussion, Dr. Barrett further highlighting the complex interplay between facial expressions, human emotions, and deciphering the emotions of others. Notably, she argues that we aren't hardwired at birth to understand and interpret facial expressions, but rather these skills are born from a mixture of our genes and our unique cultural experiences and influences, a concept referred to as cultural inheritance. Emphasizing this, Dr. Barrett explains that our brains, particularly during infancy, require wiring instructions from the world around us in order to develop the ability to interpret emotions in others accurately. She explains that babies learn to react to emotions by recognizing patterns in their caretaker's behavior. She contends that our understanding of emotions, including how we identify them in ourselves and others, is heavily influenced by these learned cultural processes. Further accentuating the seriousness of these findings, Dr. Barrett shares a chilling real-world example of how misconceptions around facial expressions and emotions can have severe consequences. She refers to a case where a woman was sentenced to death row due, in part, to an officer's interpretation of her emotional state based solely on her facial expressions, an assertion that wouldn't hold up in a scientific context. Dr. Barrett emphasizes that while there may be common facial movements that individuals exhibit, the interpretation of these expressions isn't universal, and much of it is based on our cultural learnings. One key takeaway from this discussion is that our understanding, interpretation, and expression of emotions are heavily influenced and shaped by our cultural experiences and learning. In a fascinating discussion on language and emotions, Dr. Barrett asserts that language, especially English, is insufficient in adequately expressing the full range of human emotions. She shares unique emotion words from various cultures, underlining the vast range of emotional states that exist and which our conventional language may fail to capture. In summary, Dr. Barrett provides a thorough examination of how we understand and interpret emotions in ourselves and others, highlighting the significant roles of cultural inheritance, learning, and language. She emphasizes the vast complexity and diversity of emotional states, challenging the traditional understanding of emotions as mere static entities. The focus of this discussion is how the brain interprets and reacts to signals from the outside world, aiding us in decision-making, understanding emotions, and categorizing our experiences. Dr. Barrett provides an insightful perspective on what she describes as our brain's continuous reverse problem, interpreting endpoint signals without directly knowing their causes. Your brain does not simply absorb and react to the world. Instead, it continuously guesses the origins of the signals it receives. Any noise or feeling isn't immediately understood. Your brain refers to past experience to determine how to interpret and react. These interpretations, based on evolved and learned experiences, are constantly being categorized. Dr. Barrett posits that our brain is a continuous category constructor that forms categories based on the similarity of past experiences. Using this method, the brain predicts and prepares for future experiences, effectively reducing uncertainty and enabling us to react faster and more efficiently. Dr. Barrett highlights that this process isn't static, it's dynamic and evolves over time. Context is essential, as it shapes how our brain identifies and classifies signals. For instance, how closely are loud noises spaced? Are they getting louder or less loud? The context of these changes helps us narrow possibilities and makes an educated guess about what's happening, effectively determining the category in which it will be placed. Dr. Barrett further emphasizes, using our perception of loud noises as an example, that this process isn't primarily conscious. Often our brain sorts signals and applies past experiences to current situations before we consciously dedicate thought to it. This process allows us to efficiently navigate our world. Mentioning the fundamental role of biology, Dr. Barrett explains the involvement of chemicals like serotonin and cortisol in our metabolic regulation and how it guides our system towards certain reactions. To illustrate this complexity, Dr. Huberman recalls a scene from Saving Private Ryan. In this scene, seasoned soldiers navigate threats efficiently, having categorized experiences from past battles. They know which threats are imminent and require a response, and which threats can be ignored, effectively labeling them as noise. They have unconsciously learned which stimuli signal danger and which ones do not require immediate attention. In this thought-provoking discussion, Dr. Barrett explores how the brain guesses, categories, and responds, all the while highlighting the substantial influence of past experience. Dr. Barrett's conversation with Dr. Huberman delves further into the intricate workings of how our brain processes signals and translates them into discernible emotions. As she explains, it's less about absorbing and reacting to the world and more about categorizing and interpreting signals based on past experiences. The brain functions as a signal processor, a system that receives signals, interprets them, and responds accordingly. It's akin to assembling a puzzle where every piece represents different features from our sensory surfaces. As it puts together these pieces, the image that forms is a distillation of our experiences and perceptions. The brain continuously creates categories based on these signals. It begins with broad categories like threat or pleasure. It's like constructing a library of books or experiences. Broad categories like threat might fill an entire wing of this library, whereas more specific categories like frustration might occupy just a shelf. The word anger, for instance, is not just an emotional state, but a category that summarizes a variety of experiences associated with anger. These categories are not static. They're dynamic, evolving continuously throughout our lives. Our brain effectively compares the present situation to these categories to make a guess about how to respond. This high-level abstract thinking expands the richness and layers of our emotional landscape. Dr. Barrett further explains that emotion is not a one-to-one translation. Different instances of anger can yield different physiological responses, facial expressions, or behaviors, and each instance can be interpreted differently depending on various factors. She also interestingly sheds light on the term she coined, emotional granularity, referring to the process by which our brain decides the size or granularity of the categories it constructs. Amidst all these, cultural factors play a significant role in shaping our emotional responses. Words from different languages often encapsulate specific emotions that don't exist in English, adding another layer to our emotional landscape. Dr. Barrett's groundbreaking insights into how the brain categorizes signals and creates emotional responses give us an immersive insight into the complex machinery of our minds. It reveals how our perceptions are not passive receptions, but active interpretations based on a lifetime of experiences and learnings. The conversation segues into a fascinating discussion about the creation and manipulation of compression gradients. These serve as an intriguing facet of how our brains function, delineating how the four other compression gradients act as continuous indicators, rather than finite statements. They distill complex, high-dimensional mixtures of signals we receive from the world around us, comprising both sensory and physiological inputs. Our brain is essentially playing a highly sophisticated guessing game. It starts with low-dimensional, compressed summaries like signals for anger, and makes an elaborate arrangement of abstract inferential steps to predict increasingly specific sensory motor patterns. This guesswork doesn't just transpire on the cortical sheet, but also radically takes place along the neuraxis, from the cortex to the midbrain, and even extends to the spinal cord. In essence, it travels down the entirety of the neural vertical, and every synapse along this journey is embroiled in this guessing game, adding color and depth to our ever-changing emotional landscape. Inevitably, the chat moves on to the fascinating concept of the brain's role as a decision maker, whether consciously or subconsciously. Simply put, it navigates through three basic decisions: to move towards something or away from it, or to stay put. And yet, as Dr. Barrett asserts, these are not the only considerations that our brain juggles. The ultimate function of the brain is morphed from the sampling the past based on similarity to the present into the planning of a motor action, which is not just skeletal, but is intrinsically tied to the coordination of our internal organs like heart and lungs. Hence, our perception of the world is directly influenced by these motor plans. Dr. Barrett further elucidates by using the term bins, metaphorically referring to the various categories the brain creates for dealing with the sensory soup we experience. Understandably, based on the individual's life experiences and cultural context, the size and semantics of these bins are fluid and ever-evolving. Interestingly, she suggests that the more words we possess in our vocabulary, the better our brains become at categorizing these experiences. For instance, she cites the Turkish concept of gusanluk, encapsulating emotions of loss and frustration, as an example of how language can expand our capacity to categorize these signals. In summary, this richly detailed perspective on how our brains work offers us an advanced understanding of how our emotional responses to various situational prompts are not unilateral but rather dynamic, multifaceted experiences that reflect our unique emotional landscapes. Fascinatingly, these intricate processes, layered with years of experiences, cultural influences, and language proficiencies, weave the complex tapestry of our emotional responses. Dr. Andrew Huberman and Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett delve deeper into the complex nature of emotions. especially when it comes to dealing with emotions when experiencing uncomfortable situations. They navigate topics like whether it's wise to live in the emotion and fully experience it, or whether it's more beneficial to shift and move away from it. Dr. Barrett connects this discussion to the misunderstanding that emotions are felt in the body, stating that all sensations, whether emotions, physical pain, or visual experiences, occur in the brain. They move on to a more profound discussion about emotion, the anatomy of the brain, and consciousness. Dr. Barrett explains how the brain inherently interprets and creates emotions by painting subjective narratives around sensory signals from the body, which the brain summarizes as good or bad feelings. She draws a clear distinction between mood, consciousness, and affect, which always exist, no matter if we consciously pay attention to them or not, and emotions, which are interpretations and subjective narratives that the brain constructs around what cause the sensory signals. Dr. Barrett further emphasizes that experiencing our bodies as mere physical sensations instead of emotions is often pathologized in our culture. Sometimes, she argues, it's more productive not to construct an emotion around a sensation but to experience it as it is, such as a stomachache, without labeling it as anxiety. Adding to the concept of emotions, they discuss the influence of uncertainty on arousal. As Dr. Barrett shares her personal experience, she underscores that when there's a lot of uncertainty, the brain generally manifests a high level of arousal as it attempts to gather more information to reduce the uncertainty. In the process, the two scientists discuss the fluidity of emotional experiences, showing how individual response to certain feelings or situations can drastically vary, and that the mutable nature of emotions is largely a product of the brain's functions rather than simply being a body's response. They argue that neither path, complete immersion in nor evasion of the emotion, is the right or wrong way, but instead, the approach should be situationally determined, revealing the intricacies and complexities of emotional experiences. Dr. Barrett elaborates on neurotransmitters, another layer to how we process emotions. She shares how neuromodulators that aid our learning also play a significant role in generating a sense of arousal, leading to heightened subjective experiences. Expansion on this detail introduces us to fascinating examples about reinterpretation or redirection of emotion. Dr. Barrett shares the story of her daughter's karate journey, during which her sensei advises her not just to quell her fear, but to marshal it, to get her butterflies flying in formation, so to speak. She postulates that you can train yourself to experience the physical manifestation of emotions, like a pounding heartbeat, as determination rather than as anxiety. The brain, she asserts, gives meaning to these affective feelings, and we hold more control than we think when determining that meaning. As part of giving meaning to emotions, she highlights the importance of increased categorization and fluidity in our emotional responses, and identifies them as powerful tools for understanding our experiences. Dr. Barrett also goes on to discuss dimensionality, a term explaining the fullness and depth of experiencing and understanding emotions and sensory inputs. She explains how increased dimensionality, shifting our attention and focusing on details, can immensely improve our subjective emotional experience. The podcast segues into discussing empathy and understanding. Dr. Barrett compares emotional experiences to a visual painting exercise where the cup being painted is broken down into tiny, light pieces, underlying the importance of focus and categorization in creating a fulfilling emotional experience. She suggests that people can do this with their own sensory condition of their body and emotion, stressing on the ability we have to change the dimensionality of our experience through shifting our attention, providing a more enriched and adaptive emotional worldview. Next, Dr. Huberman and Dr. Barrett touch upon the work of neurologist and author Oliver Sacks, whose exploration of the sensory experiences of animals allowed him to empathize more deeply with patients experiencing the world through different paradigms. They assert that richness of experience can make understanding others' emotional worlds possible, supporting empathy for those with minds and experiences different from our own. Finally, Dr. Barrett dives into the concept of affect and how it sets up potentials for emotion. Dr. Huberman shares his personal routine of getting sunlight and adequate sleep to manage his affect, with a brief explanation of how affect might be experienced at a basic level. The correlation between physical well-being and affect is stressed, highlighting the importance of self-care behaviors. Emphasizing the importance of affect in understanding emotions, the discussion around affect sets the stage for further discussion on sensory inputs, emotional responses, and actionable insights to manage affect for a more fulfilling emotional experience. Dr. Barrett converses with Dr. Huberman about how our body budget, the energy we have to expend and recover, affects our well-being and emotions. She likens a negative body budget to feelings of fatigue and distress. For instance, when we push ourselves during exercise, we might feel unpleasant and fatigued. However, this doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. It signifies we're working hard, and once we replenish our energy with food and rest, we're better off. She expresses an intriguing and transformative concept introduced by her daughter, the emotional flu, referring to times when our body budgets are depleted due to stress, poor sleep, or unbalanced nutrition. They talk about how we often interpret our negative feelings as indicators of something wrong in our world, instead of acknowledgments that we might simply need better self-care like more sleep, balanced meals, or physical movement. Dr. Barrett and Dr. Huberman further delve into the effects of drugs and medications like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, on our body budgets. They discuss how these substances might initially seem beneficial, but over time, they can create imbalances and further deplete our body budgets, leading to conditions like treatment-resistant depression. The conversation then shifts, emphasizing the fundamental role of sleep in mental and physical health. Both Dr. Barrett and Dr. Huberman agree that regular good quality sleep tops the list of habits to maintain a positive body budget, supplemented by eating healthy food and regular exercise. In essence, they underline the critical link between our physical well-being and our emotional condition. The dialogue concludes with Dr. Barrett emphasizing the value of human connection in regulating our nervous systems. She discusses how having supportive people around you can be a source of energy for your body budget, contributing to emotional resilience and overall well-being. Dr. Barrett and Dr. Huberman deliberated on the profound impact that others have on regulating our nervous systems. Dr. Barrett suggests that human interaction should involve building each other up, metaphorically creating savings rather than imposing a tax on each other's body budget. They note that social isolation can impose a massive tax on our body budgets, indicating the importance of social connection in maintaining our health and well-being. Dr. Barrett also touched upon an intriguing topic of synchronous behavior, citing research that revealed how two individuals who may not even know each other unconsciously synchronize their physical signals, such as heart rate and breathing, if they like each other, establishing trust. She emphasized the necessity of this balance and exchange in leadership roles within synchronization for healthy interactions. Dr. Huberman introduced the concept of narcissism, connecting it to the absence of these vital interactions where one might feel taxed instead of nourished after an interaction with a narcissist. They further dug deep into workplace dynamics, highlighting how trust within teams can significantly impact performance. If the workplace culture fosters mutual trust and contributes savings rather than a tax on team members' body budgets, teams can focus on solving challenging tasks, contributing to innovation and creativity, rather than on managing internal conflicts. Moving to more personal interactions, Dr. Barrett suggested that random acts of kindness could positively impact our body budget as well. She shared personal anecdotes about her practice of sharing bread with her neighbor, ultimately underlining the underappreciated value of kindness in our society, not just for others, but for our well-being as well. Finally, Dr. Huberman acknowledged the depth and breadth of insights Dr. Barrett provided on the workings of the nervous system. He appreciated her ability to enrich real-life experiences by adding complex nuance to language. Thanking her for her contributions in neuroscience and AI, Dr. Huberman welcomed her to future episodes for further discussions. Meanwhile, Dr. Barrett echoed his sentiments, expressing enjoyment over their insightful discourse about the intricate amalgamation of psychology and neuroscience in understanding emotions. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.